Well, we are here, it is July 21st, 2013 at the John Steinbeck Library in Salinas with community leader Dennis Donohue.
Good morning.
I'm going to ask him if you would share some of his memories of Salinas and his times in Salinas. So I'd like to know how you got to Salinas.
Well, my dad took the job as Salinas' Recreation Parks Director in 1957. So I was 3, so I pretty much went where he went. And so that's when I showed up on the Salinas scene when I was 3. And then I tell everyone I had the good fortune to marry a farmer's daughter, so I actually got grandfathered in. I get to be a native.
Grandfathered in, yeah. Now, you mentioned that your father was the Salinas Parks and Recreation Director.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about his time running the organization?
Sure. Well, it was a busy and active time. Salinas certainly was growing, and as I think back on those years, I remember the community center. My dad was a golfer, horrible slice, but he loved the golf course, and so I spent a lot of time, I'd get dropped off in the golf course during summers. So a lot of my life as a kid seemed to kind of revolve around his activities, in the sense that, he loved the golf course. I played golf as a kid. My friends played golf. I certainly remember, one of the things I often tell people when they ask me where I developed my affinity and love for the city, and I think it did come from my dad, but our dinner table conversation as kids was what was going on in the city. Sometimes you're interested, sometimes you're not. I mean, I was just a kid, but I'd hear about John Gross and the library, and I remember when they hired Robert Gordon as the planning director, and Dad would invite the family over to the house for dinner. I remember going down to City Hall and going to his office. I remember Mr. Mosier. I remember the recreation center when they still served coffee, and it was a small restaurant. And I played basketball as a kid in the rec center. So and then today is the last day of the California Rodeo, and I remember jumping in the car with my dad every night after the rodeo was over, and he'd go check the grounds out. And one of the last things I was involved with as the mayor was working with a group of folks who wanted to restore the Claes Oldenburg hats to the way they first arrived, because we unfortunately, they deteriorated a little bit over the last couple of decades, and I still remember quite vividly the discussion around the hats when they arrived and that type of thing. So I remember my dad's era pretty well, and one of the things, and I remember his retirement dinner, and he talked about the one thing that really frustrated him was that the city was never able to get a consensus and figure out how to do the Carr Lake project, and that discussion is still with us today, and an increasingly important conversation in terms of things like stormwater runoff, and an area of the city that can help us deal with our lack of green space, because we're still not where we need to be as a community. We're probably about 2/5 of the national average. And so Carr Lake remains an important opportunity for the community, but if we had only figured it out way back when, it would have been a lot less expensive, and the community benefit would have been substantial. So I certainly would share my dad's sentiment that it's a missed opportunity, and I'm sad that comment was made. I think he retired in 1982, so we're still talking about Carr Lake, and I think we kind of missed one there.
Is it a possibility still?
Oh, I think so. And in fact, frankly, I would put it in the category of it's going to be a necessity. This is a city in the era we live in. We have to expand economic opportunities. We still, this is a city of young people. We we really have an opportunity, if we have the right game plan, to really be a regional recreation mecca. And I think Carr Lake would be part and parcel of that opportunity. But the other thing is, given the regulatory environment we live in terms of things like stormwater runoff, and then some of the challenges, I'm in the ag industry, and some of the challenges we have in terms of regulatory compliance and clean water, Carr Lake could be a real critical tool to meet a lot of those needs as well. So I suspect the Carr Lake discussion will resurface sometime in the near future.
Well, certainly the plans were certainly exciting.
Oh yeah, no, they really were. Yeah, no, they really were. So, yeah, no, I remember quite a few things about my dad's time in office. So,
what do you think he was he proudest of, or was there anything that he really felt he achieved?
It's interesting. He really liked, he really believed in public service. I think my love for the city came from him. My belief in public service and its value came from him, and kind of an emphasis on local communities, quality of life. He really felt very strongly about what he did in terms of general public good. We live in a fiscally challenging era, where literally the city has been confronted with in previous years, and it may be confronted again with, how do you define the mission of a city and what are its core services? And I remember very vividly as we went through the Measure V conversations, and that was one of the things that got me heavily involved in some of the tax measures. I'm no more enamored with taxes than anyone else, but as the public, we own things. We have a personal house and we have a civic house, and and I'd like to think that civic house extends beyond just police and fire. That as a community we come together around quality of life issues, parks, libraries. That those things are really, really important, and those are things we do for ourselves, our children, and future generations, and we make sure that's always passed on. And I think that belief on my part came from him, and he was always very proud of the quality of life contribution to the community and the entire community. That meant a lot to him.
Yeah, I think historically that's been true in Salinas of a lot of citizens and stuff.
Exactly. Well, this is a city that has extraordinary community participation in its daily life. And everything doesn't have to be government, doesn't have to be the city. It can be nonprofit, it can be community groups, any number of things. So Salinas has been very, very fortunate from that standpoint. But I think the formal things that we have in common in terms of where taxes flow, revenues flow, it ought to be a vision above and beyond just a policeman and a fireman. As much as respect as I have for those two departments, and I do, I bow to no one, and their importance in the role of the community. But I also think parks, libraries, those are core services as well, and public works. If you look at Salinas as a city, we're pretty straightforward. We want to be safe. We want to be able to respond to emergencies. We want some opportunities to run around a little bit. We want the opportunity to think about our future and some intellectual stimulation, and then we ought to keep the place up a bit, and then of course somebody's still got to run the place. Now that's a pretty limited group of core services, but if you really break down Salinas, that's about what we do anymore, and I think at a minimum we ought to be doing that with each other and for each other as the residents of Salinas.
Do you think Salinas has changed a lot from when you were growing up?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. I mean, one of the things I loved about being the mayor was I was the mayor of my hometown, and having said that, I went to high school. You played sports. You played all over the community. I've lived in, I think, four houses in the city, all in the relatively same area. So in some respects, the world looks the same in terms of day to day, but of course it's not. Today, as we sit here, we're 150,000 plus, give or take, the 150th largest city in the community. We didn't have the future growth area. I was telling somebody yesterday the story. I was showing them where the county offices are on the corner of Romney Lane in Maine. And I said, that's where Sears was before there was a mall. There was no mall. And Old Town was very, very, very vibrant. But things obviously do change. And, from a very practical standpoint, I remember the story, and I forget if I was in the audience or it was an anecdotal conversation, but I always remember the story about that Leon Panetta said, when he was a kid, his dad would load everyone in the station wagon in Carmel Valley, and then they'd come into Salinas because we were the regional shopping center. Now, when I was the mayor, we were talking about the Buxton report and all of the retail hemorrhaging to outlying areas into the San Jose and to the Bay Area. So we used to be centrifugal and everything came in, and we're still a regional shopping center, but not to the degree we were. So obviously things change, but I went to Mission Park and it's still there. I went to Palma and it's still there, and I played baseball at Alice Al and it's still there. And so I think that's kind of the charm and one of the things I appreciate, that as the mayor of my hometown, as it were, it looks the same, but it's obviously a more dynamic, diverse community, and I think that's terrific.
Now, could you tell us a little something about? Well, I know you've been involved with the Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
If you want to talk about other organizations in town that had an impact. I don't know. The impact of these organizations, it doesn't seem to me, is seen by a lot of people outside the organization.
Well, and that certainly can be true, and I think one of the things I would point out, there are a number of terrific organizations in this city and indeed throughout the county, and all organizations have a bit of an ebb and flow. I was also involved with the Salinas JCs and was on their board, and if you look at a lot of the historical leadership up until a lot of folks passed through the JCs. Certain eras it was much stronger than others. The Chamber of Commerce is no different. I was involved with the Chamber in the late 80s, and then I also had the privilege of serving as the chair of the Chamber in the early 2000s, or thereabouts. It's a bit of a blur, but at the time, Chamber membership in the late 80s, my recollection was closer to 1,300 plus. In the era I was the chair of the Chamber, it was probably more. My recollection is 800 or 900. Today, I think they're flirting with 700. So I think some of that speaks to the economy. Some of that speaks to industry consolidation of various businesses. As retail chains get stronger, sometimes small businesses that were here are no longer here. The Chamber, interestingly enough, the Chamber in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I think had a really, really strong group. I think there have been a couple of great eras for the Chamber, and I was really fortunate to serve with a great pipeline of leadership, and I think arguably fairly progressive for business leadership, in the sense that we were behind a lot of the tax measures We understood that the city needed appropriate investment to provide the services that were necessary for a healthy business environment. And I think one could easily make the case during that period they were the essential organization, in the sense that if you're trying to move in a civic agenda forward, particularly if it involves revenue enhancement or retention, you need the business community on board. And because I can certainly remember one measure when I was the mayor where I found out the hard way it wasn't such a good idea to not have the chamber on your side. So they are, you know, they're a critical role, I think, in the success of this city and frankly any city, and particularly in this era, regardless of what kind of motivates or animates people, whether it's a justice issue, an environmental issue, a civic issue, you have to have resources. And so it's really important the business community be healthy and on board with a broad civic agenda. So they're really a critical part of helping move a community forward. Now, I certainly would agree with the point that a lot of times it's inside baseball and not everyone's familiar with what they were doing. We were pretty active, and I think the chamber was highly visible during that era. And but I would simply say, and you know, chambers are no different than cities. You know, the nonprofit world is really struggling in its own right. You know, how do they retain membership? How do they provide services? You know, meet member needs. So I think part of what you're talking to is, you know, groups like that have the same challenges that cities and governments do. You know, you know, unfortunately, we've been kind of fighting through an era where resources feel like a sum-zero game, as opposed to a kind of a rising tide lifting all boats. And I expect over time we'll get through that. I think we're all a little frustrated with how long that time is actually going to take.
Well, I know as taking care of local history here at the library, one of the things I find frustrating about these organizations is there is no history. I
Right.
haven't got any history.
Right.
You know, it's like, if you call them up, I don't know.
You know, one of the things I loved about being the mayor of Salinas, and it's one of the things that continues to interest me in my time moving forward, being in office, is I really love the history of this city, and I'm no different than any other former mayor. You know, the mayor of Seaside can tell you the same thing, as I'm sure the mayor of Pacific Grove would, or in that sense. But Salinas really has tremendous history, tremendous culture, and I'm not sure we've captured that like we should have. You know, one of the things I like to tell people, and it always shocks people, is, and you know, I think in 1928, give or take, we were the wealthiest per capita city in the country, and people are always stunned by that fact. And that was before the Depression. In the conversation we had before we started taping, where you talked about some of the things some of the women's organizations were involved in terms of libraries, opera houses, you know, if you go look at Main Street, I mean, 3 movie theaters. You know, for a city that was relatively small, you know, you could almost, you know, now I fully understand, because we're an agricultural economy, that a lot of our population is outside the city limits, but technically, when I wanted to have a little fun with people, I'd tell you, you know, give or take, you know, every 1,000 or people or so had their own movie theater, just to make a point that there was way more culture and history and structural support and participation for that. You know, Salinas has always cast a much bigger shadow than its actual size would suggest, and part of that is because we've our main economic engine, agriculture, has always been a North American and indeed over time global phenomena. So we've always played a little bigger.
I know that's something that I I'm interested in. At one time, we had a lot of industry.
Right,
that was
right,
around here.
right.
And then I'm also interested in the agribusiness.
Right.
But it almost seems like we've lost it.
Well, we've certainly lost some of it. It's interesting. If you look at some of the industry we've lost, like Nestle's and Peter Paul and that sort of thing. But that's candy, that's sugar, Smuckers, and we used to have sugar beets. So when the sugar beets left, the proximity to some of the factories, that connection ceased to be there. So sometimes you have to look at some of those things and that type of connection, in terms of that type of connection. I think Firestone was its own dynamic, and as we sit here today, and I've just been generally thinking about it. I don't have enough insight to weigh in on it, but Detroit has declared bankruptcy, and the reality is the federal government has bailed out General Motors, Chrysler, and if you really look at part of what happened in Detroit, because when you go from a population base from 1.8 million to 700,000, the reality is you're never going to replace that revenue, not within city limits. So as the auto industry left, is it a surprise that other institutions suffered, not including a city with a tax base, because their working assumption at 1.8 million is we'll be 1.8 million forever. Wrong assumption. But then how do you adjust? So the point is, a lot of these things are way more connected than we sometimes realize. That if the sugar beet industry leaves, then some of those things will follow. Firestone, American manufacturing, clearly relocated, moved offshore. I don't know all of the dynamics of Firestone, but that was part of an American story. If you take the most recent challenge we had, my last year in office, one day HSBC woke up in London and decided they did not want to be in the retail banking business, and they were profitable. And then they decided to sell. And I certainly understood we would have preferred certain buyers rather than others. Now, Capital One has worked with our community, but they were, a domestic buyer, had made other acquisitions, and they were more interested in, let's say, the revenue stream than the infrastructure. As opposed to if an international buyer had wanted to come in, they probably would have just changed the shingle. So depending upon those dynamics, and I think that was a really, and it remains a very painful reminder to this community. We participate in a global economy. Nobody did anything wrong in the city or the community, and in fact, we were actually kind of proactive about that. Unfortunately, we were being on guard, and so when things happened, we were already in position and working closely with Capital One, thanks to concerned HSBC management leadership who cared about our community and made sure we were at least positioned to have that dialogue. But nobody did anything wrong. But somebody woke up one day in London and made a different decision. So those are the sorts of things that are challenging for this city and any number of cities. But Detroit right now is really the poster child for big forces at work, and sometimes the results of those have unintended but clear consequences.
Do you think it would be possible to get some industry to come back to the city?
Well, obviously people are working hard, but that might be the case, and I think the city has made and continues to make a strong strategic response to kind of pivot the city towards the future. I think sometimes people tend to take agriculture's future a little too much for granted, but and we shouldn't do that. But that said, I think people do recognize there's an ecosystem and an infrastructure around agriculture that the players who are here are pretty potent. So whether it's a box manufacturer or a film manufacturer. And then the other thing, and I'm really excited for the outcomes to be determined, but this, in very broad strokes, Salinas Valley meets Silicon Valley initiative that's underway. Obviously, we're hopeful that the marriage between the fresh capital of the world and the innovation and investment capital of the world will yield some results along what lines of what you're alluding. But the thing I would say, and this is a conversation I've had with people since I've left office, when people talk about job creation, I think right now people need to be very literal and very clear. Job creation means job creation. If you're a community that's sitting around waiting for someone to relocate 500 to 1,000 people, that's probably a bad strategy. Now, could we get some spillover over time from the Silicon Valley because our cost of living is a little lower? Our real estate's not necessarily where it needs to be on a competitive standpoint. One of the things I tell people is, we've got some uphill battles in the sense that we're competing with infrastructure and facilities that there is already open capacity in Santa Clara County, which is sitting right on top of the Silicon Valley, and it's a little easier commute and that sort of thing. That said, I'm always an optimist, but we're going to have to work hard, and I really do believe people need to take very, very seriously that we're in a more entrepreneurial place than we've ever been, and it's really about job creation, and that's tough work. But over time, I'm an optimist, but it's over time.